Kate Mila-Falcha. Welcome to Irish Granny Helen. And as you are probably aware, I've been attempting to provide some content that serves as a distraction. And one of my favorite obsessions is bizarre human behavior. Almost all of our behavior, almost all the behavior of everybody is a mystery to the rest of us. But I especially am attracted, not the right word, intrigued by psychopathology. I'm always trying to figure out what makes people tick. And one of my favorite subgenres of, I guess you could call it crime, I guess I would call it crime, is cult behavior. And I think it's crime in the sense that it removes somebody's free will. It imposes an external source of decision-making on people, and it removes their agency. So I'm always fascinated by cult behavior. I feel like I was raised in a cult. People would not necessarily call it that, and I'm not going to offend people by talking too much about it. But suffice it to say that no matter what the professional definition is, and you could check with Dr. Stephen Hassan for the most up-to-date analyses of cult psychology. But no matter how you look at it, in my opinion, if you tell other people how to think and then refuse to allow them the freedom to make up their own minds, you might be in a cult. So today I want to talk about a cult. Actually, our friend Deborah Lupian asked me to do this one, so I'm happy to do it. Heaven's Gate. That might ring a bell for everybody. Very interesting group. We're going to go into the background of it, the people who were involved, and the general outcome. And I will start to get very coy about some topics because they are not embraced as terminology or subject matter on YouTube. So I'm being very careful. But I think you'll be able to tell what I'm talking about, and you'll probably remember the story anyway. So Heaven's Gate was defined as a religious movement or a cult. And it was begun by a guy called Marshall Applewhite, who subsequently changed his name to Doe, D-O, and his partner, Bonnie Nettles, who changed her name to T, T-I. So Doe and T. They met in 1972, and together they began a spiritual journey. And we don't pass judgment on that. We're all in that. They considered themselves to be the present-day manifestation of what was referred to as the two witnesses, of who were referred to as the two witnesses in the book of Revelation. This particular cult movement that they began is referred to now as a UFO religion. And it's loosely based on a strange amalgam of beliefs, including Christian millennialism. And I looked that up, and that's a belief in the transformation of society in which all things will be changed, a radical change after a cataclysm or a transformation, a transformative event. So there's Christian millennialism, also New Age beliefs, also ufology. All in a stew. As it turns out, a toxic stew. Their central belief is this, that followers could transform themselves into immortal extraterrestrial beings by rejecting their human nature. They would then ascend to heaven, which they considered the next level of evolution above humanity. This is their belief now. I'm going to be talking about a lot of ideas that don't conform to conventional science or religion or whatever. So I might point that out now and again for the sake of YouTube. Heaven's Gate believed originally that they'd ascend to a UFO before ultimately shedding their vehicles. So their whole body, so they would go up to a UFO. Then they would shed their vehicles, their bodies, and transfer their consciousness to next level bodies. So let's look at the history of the founding father and mother. Marshall Applewhite, his dad was a former soldier and then Presbyterian minister. In the early 1970s, Applewhite was fired from the University of St. Thomas in Houston for having allegedly some sort of questionable relationship with a male student. In March of 72, he met Bonnie Nettles. Now, she was 44 at the time. She was married. She was a nurse. She was really into theosophy and biblical prophecy. He met her at her job while he was visiting a sick friend. Or, because there's more than one version of this, he was a patient. It's simply not clear. And there's a speculation amongst some that the uncertainty is because if he was a patient, it may have been for psychiatric purposes. But that's all speculation. We don't know that. They came to that conclusion based on things that happened later in his life. He believed he knew Bonnie from a former past life. She said that their meeting was foretold to her by ETs, and she told him that he had a divine assignment. That was a message the ETs gave to him through her. Together, they studied Francis of Assisi, Madame Blavatsky, R.D. Lang, Richard Bach, Robert Heinlein, and Arthur C. Clarke. So you see already their beliefs swing from UFO stories to science fiction to theosophy to New Age stuff to medieval Catholicism. But Francis of Assisi was actually probably a Cathar, if not in actuality, certainly in identification with their beliefs. So this is a broad range of beliefs. It's what you would call an amalgam. But especially they were rooted in the King James Bible. They focused on Christology, the study of Christ, his ascension, and eschatology, the study of end times, the book of Revelation, the apocalypse, all of that. They believed that they were chosen as the two witnesses of the book of Revelation, so that they were actually those beings back again. And I don't believe there's a name for those individuals in the book of Revelation. They're just called the two witnesses. They called themselves the UFO 2. They believed they would be killed and resurrect as others watched. Then they would be transported to a UFO. And this was referred to by them as, with capitals, the demonstration. And this was very poorly received in general by the listening public. Now, once again, their fate that I just described is part of their narrative that they told people. On May of 74, they got their first follower, a woman named Sharon Morgan. She abandoned everything, left her family to follow them. But she only stayed with them for about a month and she returned home. She did, however, consent to leaving her credit cards with them. But I think she must have had second thoughts because they were both arrested for credit card fraud. Eventually, the charges were dropped. It was found that Applewhite was still in possession of a rental car that he'd stolen 9 months earlier. And he eventually spent 6 months in jail, mostly in Missouri, for not returning this car for 9 months. In 75, he was released and he was back again with Bonnie. And they decided to amass followers in order to contact ETs. They had meetings, they recruited disciples, but they were very clear to call these disciples their crew. I must be recording because my dogs are barking. It's axiomatic. Anyway, they called their followers their crew because the goal was to go on board a spaceship. They introduced themselves as beings from planet Next Level. And they were looking for participants in an experiment, is what they told people to recruit them. And the goal of this experiment was to achieve a higher evolutionary level. In 1975, they had a meeting in Studio City, California, and 80 people showed up. They shared their revelations that they both had independently of each other, that they were the two witnesses from the Bible, the story of end times in the Bible. They reported that they were charismatic with an important spiritual revelation. They signed up 25 people from that meeting. September 17th in Waldport, Oregon, at a motel, they had another meeting, probably in, one of those little business rooms. 20 more people joined them, sold all their earthly possessions, and everyone, all of them, vanished from the public eye. The group went underground. So this involved moving constantly. Doe and T led almost 100 people across the country, camping and begging. They didn't have jobs. They didn't establish any kind of permanent residence. They just wandered around and begged. They evaded the authorities. They evaded the media. They weren't looking for publicity. They were helping their crew, they said, achieve this higher evolutionary level. And they went by aliases. Bo called himself... they went by Bo and Doe, or Prep and T. I couldn't keep track. Jacques Vallée studied them. They weren't called Heaven's Gate yet at this point. They were called the Human Individual Metamorphosis, or HIM. They renamed themselves several times. You might say they were a cult in search of an identity. Applewhite believed that he was related directly to Jesus, and he belonged to the evolutionary kingdom level above human. He was really into reading about and writing about millennialism, which we've talked about, and Gnosticism, which we soon will be talking about, and science fiction. He believed himself to be the successor to Jesus and Jesus's present representative, the representative of Christ on earth today. And his body was a vehicle inhabited by the same alien spirit that had belonged to Jesus 2,000 years ago. T, he said, now this is Bonnie, was God the Father. And as such was Doe's older mentor. And she was older than he. I forget now, like 12, 14 years, something like that. They recruited people across the United States. They were completely destitute. They preached higher level metaphysics and metamorphosis and the deceit of humans in the past by false god spirits. They believed in enveloping themselves with sunlight for meditation and for the divinity of the UFO too. The two of them, Doe and T. In April of 76, they stopped recruiting and they became reclusive. They had extremely rigid behavior guidelines for their members. For example, they banned all drug use. They banned sexual activity. And Doe and T solidified their authority over the group. This is how cults work. Isolating you, creating this dependence for the basic needs of life, like destitution, begging, not having a permanent place to live, that instability of place and finances. And I have no doubt that they weren't resting, lack of sleep. So they went from a loosely organized social group to a centralized religious movement comparable to a roving monastery. Lots of alternative religions were popular. These movements were popular at the time, especially something called Sheilaism. I had never heard of this. This is following your own voice in faith with your own individual system. That's named after some woman who espoused the notion of putting together your own religious beliefs, chosen by the individual, without much theological consideration. It was a way to merge diverse religious backgrounds and share a generalized faith that was an alternative to the usual institutional religions. Most members of this crew were longtime truth seekers, spiritual hippies, in other words, looking to find themselves by combining faiths and creating their own culture. And I would say a lot of people do that. They just don't take it to this kind of an extreme. Some were from really unusual backgrounds other than just spiritual seekers and hippies. For example, John Craig was a Republican ranch owner who had run and lost the campaign for the 1970 Colorado State House. He joined Doe and T in 1975. So this was a communal sense of belonging to an alternative path that was outside institutionalized faiths. Their business name, because they started doing online consulting of some sort having to do with the internet, their business name was Higher Source. Beginning in the early 1990s, they used their website. Now that the business was called Higher Source, and they actually did legitimate technological things. They had a lot of really educated people that belonged to this group. It's kind of surprising. But they also had their website for their religious thing, and they used it to recruit. And the new obsession for them became the Hale-Bopp comet. This should start to ring a bell. The Hale-Bopp comet returned periodically, as comets are wont to do, and their narrative was that the comet had a secret to salvation and ascension. This whole story is included in Jacques Vallée's book, Messengers of Deception. Vallée was very concerned about contactee groups that were authoritarian in political view and also in their religious stance. Thought that was antithetical. He criticized Heaven's Gate, which was pretty well known in UFO circles, but he felt that they were too dogmatic and too rigid in their lifestyle. In January of '94, Los Angeles Weekly did an article about them called the Total Overcomers. So Heaven's Gate was found by Richard Ford in this article. He played a big role in the end. He joined them and renamed himself Rio D'Angelo. November of '96, Art Bell, the radio guy on Coast to Coast, discussed a theory of a companion object behind the comet. This program was later pointed out by some people for contributing to how the cult ended. So what's the story? The story is the Hale-Bopp comet is coming, as it periodically does, but that this time, hiding out of sight behind it was a UFO, and the goal was to get in touch with and be taken up on this UFO. Louis Theroux invited the cult in March of '97, shortly before the end, to be on BBC Two, Louis Theroux's Weird Weekends, and he's done some great documentaries about all sorts of interesting groups and situations. I would strongly recommend Louis Theroux, Theroux, and his father Paul Theroux is one of my favorite writers. He writes first-person nonfiction travel books, and they're journals of his trips, and he's especially fond of going by train. And he's gone across China by train, down India, down North and South America, from Boston to Patagonia, with just the only break was where there is no train. He took a bus. Orient Express, across Europe. He's just been everywhere by train, and he's real snarky and funny, interesting, because he just gets down there. He doesn't care about the discomfort. He doesn't care about the strangeness, but he makes scathing commentary on people, not based on a difference in culture or ethnicity, based on human behavior, and it's really funny. Anyway, his son, many of his sons do all kinds, many of his children, I think he has 7, do interesting things. One of them married, I think, Jennifer Aniston. It's an actor, something Thoreau, I can't remember. But Louis was a documentarian and has done some really interesting stuff. So we had a show on BBC Two called Weird Weekends, and they tried very hard to get the Heaven's Gate group to come and be a part of it, but he was told that they couldn't participate because it would interfere with the goal that they had, the mission that they had to focus on, which was getting on board that UFO, catching the UFO before it left the station. So the end of the group, now this is where I start having to be sort of coy and wink wink about what happened at the end. Let me just say that they came to an ultimate end. This was a communal decision. And if you want many more specifics, you could just Wikipedia it. But we're going to talk about what happened without actually saying the words. So in 95, they were in a New Mexico compound made out of tires and cement. So that sounds comfortable. They abandoned that in April of 96. And then in October, so they were probably traveling, they rented the monastery. Now, this was a 9,200 square foot mansion in Rancho Santa Fe, California. It cost them $7,000 a month to rent in 1996. You see photographs of it. It's huge. They also bought alien abduction insurance for 50 of their members that would pay out $1 million a person if the person got abducted by aliens. Okay. It covered abduction, impregnation, and death caused by alien abduction. March 13th of 1997 was that big event. They call it Phoenix Lights, but it actually traveled down through several states. Governor Symington brought a guy in a fake ET outfit for a news conference to make fun of it, and then later, after he stopped running for office, admitted he saw them too. And it was not just lights, it was a triangular shaped ship that was so big it filled the sky with lights around it. And it was seen by air traffic controllers and the military and the police and scientists and all sorts of people who otherwise had unblemished reputations. So it gave people pause. March 19th to March 20th, so not quite a week later, Doe taped a video called Doe's Final Exit. And he said that the only way to evacuate this earth, and then these are my words, is the Jim Jones method for the entire group. He saw the comet and the rumors of UFO behind it as a sign that it was time. Applewhite Now at this point, I should mention this. I forgot to mention this. Um, Bonnie had died of breast cancer, and there's a great podcast all about them. Just Google it. You can get all the details. It goes into just the finest details. It's so well written and interesting. So Applewhite and 38 members of the crew prepared for exit to release their souls before the closure of Heaven's Gate. The UFO would take their souls to another level of existence above humanity. Most of those 38 crew members taped farewell messages. 21 women, 18 men between the ages of 26 and 72 left in 3 groups over 3 days. At each point, after the first, after the second, the remaining members of the crew cleaned up, and then the last group were just found the way they were. And it needs to be said that this was 100% voluntary. Nobody was coerced the way that Jim Jones' group was coerced. It began March the 22nd to the 23rd. They took medication and applesauce and with vodka, and then plastic bags. They dressed identically in black with new Nike Decades shoes, a little ironic there, and armbands that said Heaven Gates Away Team. They each had $5.75 in their pocket. They always left home with this in their pocket for the fee to pay for vagrancy laws, because if you couldn't prove a permanent address, you'd be charged with a vagrancy offense, and it was $5. And then the quarters were for phone calls. And also, the whole amount of money was a reference to something they claimed was in Mark Twain. $5.75, he supposedly said, was the cost to ride the tail of a comet to heaven. But the truth is that Twain never said that. They were posed on their beds, and after the fact, their faces were covered with a square purple cloth. Members that were not there that day later said that the outfits that they were found wearing were actually a uniform of sorts, showing unity, signaling unity. But that the group got a good deal on the shoes, and Applewhite liked Nikes, so everybody had to wear them. And he had this slogan based on the Nike slogan called "Just Do It." One of the people that was a member of the crew was the brother of actress Nichelle Nichols of Star Trek fame, Uhura, the one with the headset. Doe was in the last third to go. The packages of a sort had been sent out previously to affiliated individuals. These were like press packages. The BBC department where Louis Theroux's show was filmed got one. Rio D'Angelo, who wasn't there at the time, he got one. It contained 2 videotapes, Doe's final exit, the group farewells on 2 different tapes, and a letter. And the letter in part said, "We have exited our vehicles just as we entered them." D'Angelo, after he got this in the mail, freaked out, and he went into the house through an unlocked back door, left unlocked on purpose, and he videotaped his entire perusal of the house, including going through the door and what he found. And then he made an anonymous call to the San Diego Sheriff's Department. A deputy came and did a welfare check and was so overwhelmed by the odor that he had to leave the house. Eventually, 38 people were cremated. The discoverer of the Hale-Bopp comet, Dr. Alan Hale, gave a speech at the Second World's Skeptics Congress in Heidelberg, July 24th of 1998. And he lambasted scientific illiteracy and willful delusion. He said talk shows deceptions about imaginary spaceships and cults led to this and encouraged bizarre yearnings for ascension. He had predicted this behavior associated with the comet. He predicted when this comet is seen again, this kind of thing is going to happen. Comets don't have an apocalyptic significance. There's nothing, if you want to actually talk about the apocalypse, the book of Revelation in the Bible, they're not equated with any sort of eschatological significance. Several days later, a 55-year-old person left a note saying, "I am going to the spaceship with Hale-Bopp to be with those who have gone before," and copied their ultimate. Several other former members came to a particular end in the days following. They used a similar ritual on the same day. A similar ritual that occurred on the same day was performed by 5 members of the Order of the Solar Temple. And people at first thought this was associated. They had very similar beliefs, but it was not, there was no actual connection between the groups. The Solar Temple was actually timed with the vernal equinox, not the comet, but it got delayed by 2 days because of other factors. So it wouldn't have happened on that day. It would have happened 2 days earlier, but things got in the way. So these people who died are sometimes referred to as victims of a hoax. And there's a website still being run by members. They still identify. The house was sold in 1999 to a developer. It was assessed at $1.4 million. It was sold for $668,000, so significantly under. And then it was raised and a new house was put in the spot. So there's a lot of debate about these guys. Were they New Age? Were they Christian? Were they UFO people? Evangelical, yes. With New Age elements, yes. Mixed with millennialism and ufology, the weird amalgam. So they're now referred to as a UFO religion. The group embraced the ancient astronauts of Erich von Däniken, Chariots of the Gods, and the Bible interpretation that aliens planted seeds and have returned to reap the harvest of the spiritually evolved, to be the crews, and to enter a transhuman state. To escape human suffering, Heaven's Gate believed you should do these things. Join Heaven's Gate, follow Doe and T, and their beliefs, whatever they said, and make sacrifices for the membership. The group changed its doctrine after Nettles, supposedly one of the chosen ones, she died of cancer in 1985, and that really set them back because she was supposed to be one of the ones who transcended, and here she, had this very human end. So they revised their beliefs. They said the leaving of consciousness from the body is equivalent to leaving Earth on a UFO. They professed to be against the behavior that put an end to them in general. So it's confusing that they ended up, I guess you'd say, evolving into doing it. They adopted new names when they entered the group. They took 3 letters and put Odie at the end. And Odie was a word chosen by Applewhite to mean children of the next level. So, for example, you would pick as your 3-letter name Gam, G-A-M, and then add Odie, and your name would be Gam Odie. To be on the next level, you had to shed human attachments, which this is resonant with a lot of religious beliefs, but also cults. Detach from family and friends, jobs, money, possessions, gender, and sexuality. They considered themselves Telah, T-E-L-A-H, the evolutionary level above humanity. They believed they were going to a physical corporeal place in another world of the universe. They would live in bliss on sunshine as their nutrition. And there's nothing there, they believed, that was mammalian. No body functions, no need to eat, nothing like that. This is their, I'm going to use the word fantasy for YouTube's sake. It's their fantasy of what they believed happened. They believed that the God of the Bible was a highly evolved ET. They thought that Luciferians, highly evolved evil space aliens who pretended to be human, came to prevent our development and intermingled with us on Earth to do that. That technologically advanced humanoids were these Luciferians, and that they had telepathy, advanced science, and I can't read my handwriting, that they would produce fake miracles with holograms. They did believe that all earthly religions, institutions were corrupted by these Luciferians. And they often, as I said earlier, modified their beliefs with time. Doe and T eventually claimed to be ET walk-ins, and that they weren't human anymore at all. Their bodies may have been physical human bodies, but that their spirit beings, their consciousness, was something other. Doe claimed to be the same walk-in that had taken over Jesus, in their opinion. Therefore, Jesus had been human, but he had a sacred entity inside of him. And they have a list of ways in which to reach the next level in case you want to get there. The first is you could be physically picked up by a UFO. That's called capture. You can have a natural or accidental end. You can suffer persecution that leads to your end, like the Branch Davidians and Ruby Ridge people. You can do what they called a willful exit in a dignified manner, which would have been what their choice was defined as. That your animal souls could enter the next level humans. And there were rules for how you could, for membership, how you could join. You had to be 18. You had to give away all your possessions. You had to live an aesthetic lifestyle in a communal environment, communal sharing. Volunteers would be castrated. They first tried to have a nurse do it, and the member almost died. So the rest of them were actually done in a hospital. They made money by doing professional website development. They're sometimes called a cyber sect because they relied so heavily on computer communication to recruit. So there's a great documentary about them, and they've been spoofed on SNL. And there's a podcast called Heaven's Gate that came out on the 20th anniversary of their demise. And that's the story of Doe and T and Heaven's Gate. And I will be doing a session with Deborah sometime in the near future here. We kind of collect them and do them all at the same time. And I will tell you this, we did one on JonBenet Ramsey and we did one on Maura Murray. And given the specific details of what Deborah saw, we don't feel comfortable putting it out there. So sorry. So So thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this. It's very interesting. I strongly recommend the podcast. It's very, very, very well done. So thanks for watching. Slán go fóill, slánte.